The brisk cadence of hundreds of men in plate armor filled the air around Ray, echoing up the slopes of a shallow ravine leading to the bottom of the highland plateau's eastern valley. Their course was relatively straight, leading directly to the ford below the escarpment where the enemy's main force awaited them. Could it be any more obvious of a trap? Did the battalion's straightforward movements signal obliviousness or the fact that they understood that a trap had been set? Was that all to the trap there was? Understanding the battlefield and how an enemy commander would act was a complex enough exercise when it was only humans involved. Adding non-humans added a whole slew of unknowns that cast one adrift in a sea of possibilities, a vast frontier no less challenging than the physical frontier that faced the 6th Legion. Ray peered through the trees to the east. Somewhere in the distance, Lady Zaradnik's company was preparing for their part of the battle. The gradual revelations that she brought to his awareness were deeper than words could express, and she had likely chosen her peculiar methods due to this. Was it a calculated choice? Though he was now aware of certain aspects of her personality, others remained inscrutable. As he methodically reprofiled her character, motivations and behaviors, Ray suspected that much of what she did was not due to conscious calculation. Many things about the Baroness suddenly made sense if one considered her an individual that acted intuitively. This meant that she was the type who reliably knew the correct answers before understanding why they were correct. In an empire where competence and success were attributed to logic and reason, those who functioned this way were at best suppressed. Those in power did not accept intuition or feeling as valid in proposals and procedures, nor would any authority or resources be granted to people who operated in that fashion. In fact, the Empire considered such individuals dangerous gamblers and worked to strip them of their power, wealth and influence. A few managed to thrive, however. Most were employed in artistic vocations which were deemed mostly harmless by the central bureaucracy. Some possessed the intelligence and patience to take what they knew to be correct and work through things backwards to figure out why. Lady Zaradnik appeared to be one such person, which was surprising considering her young age. Perhaps she had the benefit of a mentor in her family or one from the Sorceress Kingdom. Cheswin here. Report. My rangers found one of the positions you were looking for, sir. 2 kilometers south by southwest. Numbers? Maybe around 1,000. They're looking to the southeast, so it might be the northernmost group on that side. Let's not make that assumption yet. We'll see what the others locate. What sort of demi-humans do they have? That we've seen so far? The same mix. They're laying low, though, so we might have missed anything new. No visible lords, either. No hobgoblins? Nothing human-sized was spotted, but again. I got it. Keep me updated on new developments. Yes, sir. So far, it seemed, so good. Nothing out of the ordinary to deal with and no hobgoblin officers that might swiftly communicate the situation to the enemy army's commander. Ray shifted the direction of his battalion slightly to the west, but not enough to suggest that they had detected the ambush group. Ideally, he wanted to get close enough to spook them into attacking. That way, the enemy commander would have to decide between losing the group to maintain the trap or moving in with all of his forces to salvage their compromised plan. The former would give Ray a free battle and the latter would see the enemy sacrificing their advantageous position and employing an awkward maneuver that disrupted their careful preparations. How quickly they reacted would also give Ray an idea of how many commanders were present in the demi-human army. Zaradnik here. Yes, my lady. My rangers have started to return with their reports. The first warband in our half is roughly 1,500 meters to the southeast of my company. One Overlord that doesn't appear to be very strong. No hobgoblins. Nothing else of note. Numbers? Big tribe is the estimate. My apologies, Your Excellency. Goblins aren't so great at counting. Your goblins weren't detected? I'm sure that they were, but they have plenty of leeway. The enemy is looking out for humans and some goblins wandering around in the dark aren't going to attract much attention when there are thousands of goblins in the area. Goblin spies. Given the prevalence of goblin populations in the wilderness, it was another compelling reason to employ them in the 6th Legion. You're not worried that they'll betray you to their fellow goblins, my lady? No. They aren't from the same tribe and are just as likely to fight against one another in a normal situation. My goblins are part of my tribe and I've not given them any cause to resent me. I see. Get within 1 kilometer of the first enemy camp and wait for my call. My battalion needs to attack first and become the focus of their attention. Understood, Your Excellency. Yulara here. On the heels of his orders, another report came in. Let's hear it. Rangers just came back, sir. There's another camp about 2 kilometers past this closest one. 1,500 demis set up all cozy on a big outcropping. Captain Yulara's voice was noticeably subdued. They were up to roughly 8,000 enemies now, 8,000 to their 1,000. As expected, their enemies had resorted to a trap using superior numbers to encircle and destroy them, meaning that there should be at least one more group on the opposite side for Lady Zaradnik's forces to deal with. Days here. What did you find? There's a third group on our side. Over 1,000. 4 kilometers south, just off of the river. That's it, then? Seems like it, sir. 5,000 across the river, 4,000 on the right. If the trap was symmetrical, they were well over the initial upper estimate of 10,000. A thrill of anticipation rushed through him. Would their equipment, discipline and tactics prevail? Or would the hastily recruited goblin army overwhelm them with sheer numbers? The battle would mark a new era in the Imperial Army's history either way, but a feat of impossible valor would make for a spectacular opening. Zaradnik here. We're a kilometer from our first objective. Stand by. Ray looked to his right as they continued advancing along the west side of the ravine. The slopes weren't particularly steep, but they were still steep enough to steal the energy from any charge. Cheswin, how far off is that first demi-human group? They're directly to our right, about 500 meters. Looks like they're sitting tight, though. He looked up through the trees. Zaid. Sir? We're about to begin. Keep an eye on the group to the southwest of us, let me know the moment they move. On our way. One by one, the companies stopped as Ray reordered them to face the first demi-human ambush group. His heavy infantry took the left flank while the dismounted cavaliers formed the rest of the front. A group of 50 rangers formed ranks to the right of Ray's bodyguard, where the battalion's war wizards were held in reserve. Do you plan on giving the men some inspiration? Bennett asked. As if those demi-humans will wait for that, Ray answered. Close to 200 meters. The battalion advanced, boots stepping in time with one another over the rocky forest floor. Ahead of them, the demi-humans massed to face their approach. The moonlight flowing down through the skinny conifers of the highland seemed to highlight their rising agitation. Lady Zaradnik, we're in position. You may begin your assault. On our way. May Sursana guide your hand. He blinked at the Baroness' words. While religion still played an important role in the Imperial Army, it was a quiet undercurrent that went mostly unnoticed outside of private affairs. Pious blessings were nearly unknown from all but the priesthood. The god of justice, judgment and death. A divine patron suited for a noble, I suppose, or a military officer. Ray's battalion came to a halt. He swept his gaze over the demi-humans as they shouted out their challenges and made threatening displays. Rangers, start thinning out this mob. Focus on their left flank if possible. From beyond the range of goblin shortbows, arrows flew in to hammer the demi-human mob. While it would have been nice if the Rangers could just send 20 arrows each into their enemies to deal with most of them, their opponents recovered from their initial confusion quickly enough. They boiled down the slope, ogres leading the way with large branches serving as improvised clubs. Prioritize the ogres. Rangers, you too. Watch for flanking attacks by all those goblins. Arrows and crossbow bolts hissed through the air, scything down the leading edge of the demi-human charge. A second volley of arrows arced over the infantry line, followed by a second volley of crossbow bolts in time with the third volley of arrows. Prepare for contact. Crossbows were set down, replaced by spears, shields and longswords. The much diminished demi-human charge faltered as they faced a wall of imperial steel. Calls to brace sounded across the line and the few dozen surviving ogres were stopped in their tracks. They fell moments later as the second rank put multiple spears into each of them. Well, that was overkill, Ray muttered. Front rank, advance. The rest of you, recover your crossbows and pick off all those goblins. With the fall of their heavy infantry, the goblin skirmishers could only offer token resistance. Their crude stone arrows bounced off of the plate-clad line as black-fletched iron bolts struck them down in return. In less than 15 minutes of the Rangers' opening volley, The demi-human forces had been decimated, its survivors scattering into the forest. Ray nodded quietly at the results. Given what they were facing, it seemed like a foregone conclusion. Both he and the enemy commander understood that the demi-human denizens of the Highlands needed sufficient numbers to absorb losses and overwhelm the Imperial Knights. Without those numbers, they were no match for the discipline and equipment of the Imperial Army. Reform ranks. We're just getting started. He glanced towards the next demi-human position, wary for signs of movement through the trees. After setting his men on a brisk march to the distant outcropping, Baroness Zaradnik's voice sounded in his head. Zaradnik here. We're cleaning up our first group. I can't hear any fighting from your side. We're on the march to the main body on this end. Scouts report 1,500 demi-humans and another 1,000 beyond them. I haven't received any reports of an enemy reaction. We'll try and keep moving in time with your attacks, then. The outcropping where the second demi-human force in their path awaited became visible through the trees 5 minutes later. From a distance, it looked not much more than a bump along the terrain, but Ray imagined that, to any commander, it made for an attractive vantage. This is Zaid here. That group you're headed for is repositioning to face you. Can they complete their maneuver in time? I think so. They all started moving at once and they're being pretty quick about it. What do you see along the top of that outcropping? Just a moment while I get in closer, sir. Some trolls, mystics, I think? I see 'em. 3 hobgoblins with a bugbear bodyguard. Should we sear them off that rock with fireballs? No, conserve mana and stay invisible. We'll need you when the enemy commits all of their forces. Understood. As they closed on the demi-humans, Ray noted that the enemy's level of organization was far greater than the group they had just dealt with. Their ranks were neatly sorted by function with sufficient weight to absorb charges and used improvised shields to weather harassment from range. He had never fought against hobgoblins with such large numbers at their disposal, but the difference that they made was clear at a glance. Do you want the mages in on this, sir? Tota asked. I'm not sure yet, Ray answered. As imposing as this group looks, it's only 10% of the enemy force. Breaking them up as we did with the previous group will be ideal. We still have the same advantages over them as before. Yovel here. Report. The demis are moving, sir. Which ones? All of them. Converging on your position. Even the group near Lady Zaradnik. I'm not sure exactly where Lady Zaradnik's forces are, sir, but the group she should be hitting next is headed straight across the way for you. Understood. Don't do anything yet, I'll have orders for the air wing later. So this is where we make our stand. Ray took a deep breath. As soon as he touched the hobgoblins, the entire army moved so they could probably use the same battlefield communication skills that commanders and captains could. Still, it was not the worst-case scenario. Not by a large margin. He eyed the demi-human position, peeling it apart in his mind. Looks like the demis have woken up. The ones in front are keeping our defensive position warm for us. We have 30 minutes to kick them out. Rangers, start hitting them as soon as we get in range. Everyone else, advance to 150 meters and use crossbows. Mages remain in reserve. The enemy formation stirred but held as the first volleys started raining down on them. Diminutive shadows came forward as goblin skirmishers were sent to counter them, but getting close enough to use their shortbows made them easy marks for Ray's men. As with the previous group, what little that reached the Imperial Knights bounced harmlessly off of their plate armor. 5 minutes later, the hobgoblins pulled back their skirmishers. The demi-human ranks fell back to hide behind the outcropping. Ray eyed the enemy commander's exposed position. Advance to 100 meters. Keep that pressure on them. Watch for anything sneaking in from the flanks. This is Zaradnik. There's a small chasm blocking our path on this side. We're headed in your direction while looking for a way across. The entire demi-human force is converging on my battalion, so we're kindly asking for this group here to give up their defensive position. We'll be setting up the anvil here. How do you want me to hit them, Your Excellency? I've placed my heavy infantry on my left flank. If you can free them up, they can help roll up the rest of the demi-human forces. We'll be holding fast until then. Understood. We'll be on our way after we deal with these warbands, but it may take half an hour or more. There's plenty we can do here to give them pause. Oh, The second group on this side has hobgoblins, so they may be on your side as well. I see. I'll silence them as soon as possible. Ray eyed the hobgoblins atop the outcropping, who were bellowing out orders to their warband. Lady Zaradnik made it sound as if she could simply leap in and assassinate enemy officers. Maybe she could, but it was yet another asset that the 6th Legion did not have at its disposal. The strongest soldiers in the Empire went to the 1st Legion, the Royal Earth Guard, the Royal Air Guard, the White Salver Imperial Guard and the Great Imperial Knights. These units were all present as the Emperor's bodyguard or as the forces defending our winter. A case needed to be made for at least a few of Baharuth's mightiest warriors to act as captains and champions for the expeditionary force instead of concentrating them all in the centers of political and economic power. If our winter employed Death Series servitors, those warriors wouldn't be needed there anyway. His battalion continued their methodical advance, laying a withering rain of arrows and bolts upon the demi-humans still exposed to their attacks. As they came closer, a few magic arrows, acid arrows and scorching rays struck his ranks. It was nothing the battalion's clerics couldn't keep up with, however. Eventually, the last few demi-humans were forced off of the stony outcropping. Be careful pushing around. We need to kick them out, but we still have the main event ahead of us. Rangers, get up top and get rid of anything nasty looking below. The sounds of battle rose as he ascended the enemy commander's former post. He looked up to a ranger who was sending arrows into the melee. What's happening down there? Another group just came in from the southeast, sir. They're trying to push back. That should be the 3rd warband on his side. Ray stepped up to the top of the outcropping and examined the scenery below. The new group was still swarming in from the southeast, pushing into the backs of the retreating defenders. Ray's battalion was coming around from both sides, but the sheer weight of bodies before them stalled their advance. A stone arrow from below bounced off of his helmet, causing him to duck instinctively. Clerics, get bless and prayer up as you can. We need to secure this position. Make sure you don't overlap too heavily. The sounds of fervent spellcasting rose to either side. In the distance, Ray thought he could see the main body of the demi-human army, a shifting mass that filtered through the trees in the bright moonlight. Zaid, what does it look like up there? The main force just finished crossing the river, sir. They've formed ranks and they're marching towards you now. All right, this is what we've been waiting for. Put every fireball you can into them. I want a carpet of roasted corpses from there to here. Will do. May the gods watch over you, General. Ray narrowed his eyes at the mass of bodies struggling below. His men had barely made any ground, but neither did they seem to be struggling. At their current rate, however, the main demi-human force would swarm over them before they could reorganize their defenses. Rangers, light up the woods around us. Mages, get up here and ready yourselves. Let's pick up the pace. His battalion roared their affirmative, renewing their deadly offensive. Flight arrows enchanted in advance with continual light flooded the battlefield with their radiance. Steel already drenched in blood struck out in its thirst for more. The tide of demi-humans reversed, but it wouldn't be long until 5 times their number came to join the fray. Zaradnik here. The 2nd warband on this side is down. There were hobgoblins here, but I think I got them before they could warn the rest of the army. It seemed that she could just assassinate enemy officers in the middle of their regiments. It was yet another thing that the Imperial Army needed an effective counter for. The 3rd warband on this side joined the 2nd mid-fight. We're still working on them. I've ordered the air wing to begin their attack, so we should be seeing their handiwork soon. Our 3rd warband is nearby. We'll be coming up from behind them and joining you after that. Any sign of a response from the main body? Ray hefted his shield, propping it up on a rock in front of him before looking out over the valley. With the rangers planting their lighting in the trees all around, the world beyond had become a dark and formless void. All he could see was the churning mass of bodies below. I'm not sure. The air wing hasn't noted anything and I can't see anything of the sort from my vantage. We already have continual light on the trees around us, so vision beyond that is impaired. A rock flew up, caving in the head of the ranger beside him. Ray cursed, lowering himself below the edge of the stone again. A series of explosions sounded in the distance. He crawled up and took a peek at the battle below. His battalion was only halfway to joining their 2 flanks. Fireballs continued to sprout from the darkness at regular intervals, casting shadows from the multitude of demi-humans closing on their position. Zaid. How are you doing with that main body? We're roasting goblins left and right, sir. The bigger stuff, not so much. It's taking 2 or 3 fireballs to kill the ogres. Even more for the bugbears and trolls. Keep at it. I want everything you have. Yes, sir. He clenched and unclenched his fist, trying to make details out of the advancing formation. His 2 flanks were nearly joined, but with so many in the enemy's main body, they could split any which way. Furthermore, these would presumably be the most powerful forces in the goblin army. What would hurt me the most? If any extremely powerful individuals were present in the enemy army, they would have probably sent them in advance to reinforce their struggling allies. At least this was his assumption from the defensive maneuvering that the hobgoblins had displayed thus far. Conventionally speaking, I want mages overlooking the right flank. If there's a way to screw us, it'll be throwing shock troops at our cavaliers. Footfalls sounded from behind him as his men moved to reposition themselves. 400 meters away, the ranks of the demi-humans' main force entered the edges of their magical lighting. A glance was all it took for Ray to make out their formation. By the gods, I did not want to be right about that. They have trolls and bugbears on their left wing. We've got a hard fight ahead of us. Don't be stingy with mana and consumables. Mages, prepare fireballs and wait for my call. If you don't have fireball, use acid arrow on the trolls. Air wing, squeeze out what you can on the enemy's left. Arrows peppered the advancing shock troops. The ground rumbled as they came forward like a herd of stampeding aurochs, bearing towards the ranks of dismounted cavaliers braced for their charge. A few fireballs from above blossomed in their path, but their fearless abandon drove them forward through pain and death. Steady. Mages, take your marks. The line of demi-humans crossed the 20-meter mark. Unleash hell. Spheres of flame the size of a man's fist rained down across the front. The resulting conflagration bathed the landscape with its orange glow, carrying with it the screams of their burning enemies. A savage grin formed on Ray's face as the stench of burning flesh wafted over him. Don't stop, keep going. Cast at will. The second line of shock troopers was incinerated, its few survivors overwhelmed by the awaiting cavaliers. Another line broke through, however, untouched by the inferno laid down by the battalion's war wizards. What happened? The spells landed, sir, but they have energy resistance on them. Son of a. Caught off guard, 50 men were instantly crushed as the wave of magically reinforced shock troops crashed into them. The mages watched, aghast, looking to Ray for orders. We can't fireball our own men, sir. Those casting acid arrow, support our front line. Keep those fireballs going, we still have plenty of demis incoming. Ray narrowed his eyes, watching as his right flank bent backwards under the demi-human assault, devolving into a chaotic melee. Occasionally, a man was sent flying over the line and a cleric scrambled over to see if they could be healed. He looked over at Bennett. Bennett, take the clerics here and support the right. We can't let them break through. Yes, sir. He turned his gaze towards the skies. Dragoons, drop and reinforce the right where needed. Already on location, the dragoons of the Legion's air wing fell upon the trolls and bugbears, driving spears into heads and backs. Their mounts followed within seconds, rending all enemies within reach. The beleaguered cavaliers rallied around them, restoring their buckling lines. Yet, they were far from stabilized. A sea of demi-humans flowed towards them, unharassed by arrows and spells. For all of their efforts, they were being pushed back by the sheer mass of their enemy. We're here. Savage roars rolled over from behind him, joined by a rousing cheer from Ray's left flank. He turned to see a silver arc flash into the press of battle below. Something isn't right. The thin thread of thought followed Ludmilla as she cut into the right flank of the main demi-human force. She could see from the looks of her foes that many immediately understood they could not stand against her. Her ring of non-detection should have blocked any direct attempts at gathering information about her, but she supposed that didn't count for much when someone suddenly appeared and sliced half a dozen people in half. They faltered and scrambled to get away, pushing into one another to find a more likely opponent. Even so, she didn't hesitate to cut them down. So long as their will to fight remained, so long as they intended to bring harm to her allies, those who had come to do battle would fall to her blade. It wasn't usually their way, nor was it usually her way. Usually, there were signs, warnings, a clear message that, if a certain line was crossed, there would be no quarter granted until that line was respected again. When conflict grew beyond the sphere of individual stakes, however, individuals were consumed by its indiscriminate blaze. On this nameless wilderness plateau, the fires of war had been lit. Not one that she had asked for, nor did they. It was one sparked by the Empire, a child accustomed to getting things their way. At least that was how it had started. Awareness and understanding had seeped into the ranks of the Imperial Army, enough to have her believe that their future efforts would not be so catastrophically tragic for all involved. Now, all that was left to do was to force the blaze to burn out. With their crude equipment and lack of martial arts, the rank and file could not challenge her, no, could not even hurt her, yet she killed them all the same. They screamed in fear and desperation, cried out to their friends and comrades for help. Some even cast tear-filled looks at her, pleading to be spared. And then they died. Every stroke paved her path with new corpses, every step on that path brought her within measure of more. As she gouged her bloody way towards the heart of the demi-human army's right flank, something changed in the way they reacted to her. Fear gave way to loathing, desperation, to hate. As if understanding that those who had committed themselves to the fight would be offered no quarter, their attitudes transformed. She was no longer a fearsome monster to be avoided, she was a threat to their very existence, one that had to be put down at all costs. Hundreds of rocks and arrows bounced off of her like grains of sand swept up by the wind. She kicked away a troll who flung itself bodily at her, eyes rimmed with rage. Goblins swarmed toward her as she recentered herself, thrusting their makeshift spears at her with mad screeches. Ludmilla swept aside their attacks, cleaving through them with her reverse stroke. Another troll came roaring in, uncaring of the allies it trampled in its charge. No, not uncaring. Everyone that faced her knew that they were dead. They knew they would be dead unless she died first. A blossoming iris blasted the troll away, sending it tumbling over dozens of its fellows. Yet, still, they came, an endless swarm that screamed for her blood. Was this the storied savagery of the demi-human tribes? The behavior that set them apart from all other foes described in the tales told to civilized society? She could understand how those who witnessed it could mistake it as such. It was not so much a specific action or event as it was a place, one where the rules that bound everyday life unraveled, where existences had become irreconcilable and a violent resolution was demanded of them. A place where survival hinged on the death of one's enemies and everything was allowed. Be it the survival of an individual, their family or their entire society, that savagery the fight for life, was the same. But it didn't have to be that way. It was something to be forced upon others when the balancing forces of the world were not being observed. She split an ogre across the waist and blinked as she came across an unexpected sight. A smile grew on her face. Found you. How the kill this bald ape? The already frenzied demi-humans in the vicinity surged towards her at the hobgoblin's command. Ludmilla lightly stepped back, stabbing at the wave of goblins that scurried towards her with flint daggers and stone spears. A part of her rued the fact that she hadn't yet mastered any martial arts that dealt with large numbers of opponents, but she had other options. She continued retreating, eyeing the hobgoblin as the distance grew between them. Ook, he's open. Thudding steps sounded from her left as the mountain troll and his entourage stormed through the gap created by the hobgoblin's desperate command. The human-sized goblinoid let out a shriek before it was flattened by Ook's tremendous overhead swing. 3 mountain trolls to his right turned to clear away the 100 or so demi-humans caught between Ludmilla and them. In the surrounding area, the demi-humans seemed to lose heart at the death of the hobgoblin. Their ferocity abated somewhat, hesitation filling their movements. Ludmilla waved Ook and his trolls over. Good work, gather and hold your positions for now. Catch your breath while we reorganize our lines. Ludmilla took inventory of their surroundings, trying to get a sense of the battle's progress. The surviving demi-humans on the enemy's right flank, perhaps numbering around 1,000, were withdrawing towards the center and the left flank of the Imperial battalion advanced in their wake. General Ray had preemptively placed his staunchest defenders in the position that he believed exposed to the greatest risk, and they emerged from their holding action in relatively good condition. The battalion's center, however, was crumbling and his right was out of view behind the stony outcropping. Fireballs, lightning bolts and other evocation spells lit up the night not 20 minutes previous, but they were absent now. She didn't imagine that the battalion's clerics were doing much better on mana. Ludmilla raised a hand to her left ear out of habit, looking toward the battalion's center. Zaradnik here. My lady, that was a timely entrance. Was the collapse of that flank your doing, as well? Yes, Your Excellency. We found a hobgoblin near the back center here. How is the rest of the battalion doing? We took a huge beating when they charged, but we're holding for now. My right is in shambles. I've shored them up with support from the dragoons and my rangers. Hopefully, we can break up the enemy center before my right has nothing left. I'll rejoin the fight shortly. Was there anything of note that you've observed? Not really. There are demi-human lords mixed in with these enemy groups, but they're not far above the rest. They've been trying their damnedest to kick us off of this rock, so what they have here should be their whole strength. For all of his battalion's troubles, General Ray still sounded upbeat. His forces, however, were very much beaten down. Then again, surviving it all was probably a questionable outcome. Her forces remained intact. More than intact, somehow. Ludmilla and Uke's trolls acted as the vanguard while her wall of ogres allowed the goblins behind them to rain arrows over the field without interruption. They were long out of ammunition from the Imperial army, but, with so many dead goblins in the enemy forces, their usual stone arrows were essentially unlimited. All they had to do was advance and salvage the quivers of the dead as they went along. Pressure on their shield wall was relatively light, with the trolls fighting in front of it. If one of the trolls sustained significant injuries, the shield wall opened up so they could rest and regenerate in safety before rejoining the battle. It was a set of simple steps that her company could follow, yet it appeared to be extraordinarily effective. In light of this, Ludmilla could only wonder what an advanced demi-human nation was capable of. Breaks over. Uke, lead everyone around to the rear of their center. I'll be going through from this corner here. Ludmilla made her way over to the deadlocked ranks of Imperial heavy infantry nearby, breathing in the emotions extracted by the events of the battle. Her steps slowed before she reached them. Something isn't right. Fear, hate, desperation, anguish, sorrow. As the dark maelstrom of emotions flowed into her, she suddenly realized what was happening. It's not something that isn't right. It's someone. Me. She was absorbing the nearly intangible traces of negative energy left upon the land as the battle raged on and death collected its due. But why? This wilderness was not her domain. Nor was it anywhere near it. Though she could sense them, the small, slowly dissipating patches of negative energy generated throughout General Ray's campaign did not interact with her being. Ludmilla forced herself to move forward again, to focus on the task ahead of her. Her glaive bit into the demi-human forces, which had stabilized from her assault on their right flank and were now trying to draw in and envelop the renewed push of General Ray's left. The demi-human ranks recoiled from her sudden movement and the nearest Imperial soldiers let out a cheer. 100 meters ahead, Uke and his trolls started bashing their way into the rear of the enemy center. Ludmilla activated Ability Boost and Wind Stride, maintaining them as she incorporated Slash and Pierce into her attacks, trimming down the extended edge of the demi-human flank. Rousing shouts rose from behind her while screams of terror attracted her advance. Silver arcs flashed in the moonlight as she cut a swathe through goblins and ogres with equal ease. Though she felt perfectly tranquil through it all, Ludmilla wondered how she appeared to everyone. Was she inspiring? The image of grace and beauty on the battlefield? Or was she a fearsome spectre of death, an executioner that scythed her way through a field of bodies as easily as a farmer cut down stalks of grain? A part of her didn't want to know the answer. Zaradnik. 50 meters ahead and to your right. Her gaze shifted at General Ray's notification. A clump of trolls and ogres froze as her eyes fell upon them. Above the din, the harsh orders of a hobgoblin organized the demi-humans nearby. Their ranks were notably thinned, however, as many had been diverted to hold back Uke, who was pressuring their rear. I see them. Ludmilla headed their way, dispatching a dozen goblins in swift succession. The hobgoblin and its bodyguard pushed in the opposite direction, trying to create distance. More demi-humans flowed around them and towards her, threatening to wash her away. She focused on the retreating hobgoblin even as her glaive worked to slaughter his subordinates. Surrender. You cannot win. Preserve the lives of your subordinates. The hobgoblin leveled an incredulous look at her. A long moment passed as the battle around them seemed to fall into a lull. Then a massive tentacle slapped him out of existence. Ludmilla lowered herself into a defensive stance as another tentacle whipped in, its broad tip flattening one of the trolls in the former hobgoblin's bodyguard. The two tentacles swept the remaining demi-humans into the air, sending them crashing into their ranks a dozen meters away. A huge midnight black form leapt into the light, its long, bestial figure seeming to shimmer into multiple images. Guttural growls filled the air as smaller versions of the magical beast tore in from the west, sending demi-humans scattering in all directions. Amid its multiple images, Ludmilla's true sight made clear its true form. Further examination revealed that it was not a magical beast at all, it was a true monster. A powerful feline form of 7 meters was carried on 6 legs rather than 4. 2 tentacles sprouted from its shoulders, ending in broad tips with bone-spiked pads on one side. Eyes like fiery emeralds glowed malevolently over the fanged maw of a great cat. I suppose I was looking out for one of these. The monstrous feline twisted in place, its tentacles whipping out to kill scores of demi-humans with every lashing strike. It was stronger than her, stronger than Ook, and she was fairly certain it hadn't come to help the Imperial Army. Ludmilla ruefully thought back to her discussion with General Ray. Some powerful beings simply didn't care for any side and could just as easily destroy every side. Another lesson for the Imperial Army to take home. Zaradnik, what is that? I have no idea. The Lord of a Monster Pack is my best guess at the moment. How many followers does it have? We can't tell. They're tearing into the demi-human army from the west, but they have some sort of ability that casts multiple images of themselves. One of my war wizards says it's like a displacement spell. Displacement was a third-tier arcane illusion that caused observers to perceive that the target was in a different spot from where it was. It had the effect of total concealment, causing attackers to miss as often as hit their mark. Ludmilla saw where the spell wanted her to see the monster, but, at the same time, she knew its true location. The question was whether foiling its ability made it easier to fight than it seemed. Or perhaps that wasn't a question at all. No rule dictated that monsters, heteromorphs and demi-humans were to adhere to some arbitrary standard of fairness. Ludmilla supposed that this applied to her as well. She couldn't abandon her allies, so all that was left was to discern the difference between them. Backing away quietly, she turned her attention to her tribe. Go on the defensive. Quit the battlefield without attracting attention when you have the chance, but do it together. Ook, come back here when they're safely away. By the time she looked back at the new entry to the battle, it had cleared a 50-meter wide space around itself. The Pack Lord's guttural growl filled the air as it surveyed its handiwork. Ludmilla gathered her steps as she carefully came forward, testing to see if all of its thrashing about had rendered her concealment effective against it. So far, so good. Ludmilla drew closer to the massive monster as it seemed to savor the fear of its lessers emanating across the battlefield. She eyed its stark length, trying to figure out where a solid strike would do the most good. With the difference in apparent strength between them, it was an attack that could possibly determine the outcome of their fight. At 10 meters, the hard snicks of crossbows being loosed filled the air. A throaty snarl filled the air as bolts rained down all around Ludmilla and her target. Roughly half of them fell in the vicinity of their target, mostly bouncing off of its dark hide while the rest fell far off the mark. A handful bounced off of Ludmilla's deflection enchantment. What are you doing? She shot forward as the Pack Lord gathered itself to pounce, aiming herself at a point 10 meters before it. Arm drawn back, she readied a blossoming iris. Wherever it hit, it hit. The monster launched itself at the heavy infantry line and Ludmilla's advanced strike art hammered it squarely in the middle right shoulder. The creature roared in surprise, skidding sideways through its interrupted charge. Ludmilla centered herself to face her adversary as it twisted to examine its wounds. Blood flowed freely from 3 deep lacerations, but the wiry limb prevented her from reaching its vital areas. She wasn't sure whether her glaive's ability damage had stuck. As for herself, her brow furrowed as she realized that she hadn't taken as severe a backlash as she should have. With ability boost and wind stride reserving 2 focus stages, she should have only had 1 to spare. Blossoming Iris was a 3rd stage strike art and going 2 over should have resulted in significant punishment. Her regeneration, however, was well on its way to mending all of the resulting damage. I have 4 focus stages now? If so, the fight might have become far easier. She held the monster's baleful gaze, applying intimidating pressure to her own. The Imperial soldiers on the other side shifted away nervously, but her opponent only glared back at her as it tried to size her up. With the effect of her ring of non-detection, its only measure of her was probably her powerful opening strike. "What are you doing here?" Ludmilla asked. The Pack Lord narrowed its eyes, then seemed to give her an evil leer. One of its tentacles lashed out to the side, brutally crushing a half-dozen heavy infantry where they stood. The surviving men of the battalion's left flank cried out and scattered back. "Oh, you didn't just do that." Ludmilla darted forward. The second tentacle darted to intercept her, filling her vision with a meter-wide pad of serrated barbs as long as her hand. She twisted her grip, facing the blade of her weapon upward as she thrust directly towards it. Invulnerable fortress. The tentacle was stopped by the tip of her glaive. She deactivated the defensive art, raising her polearm in an upward slash. Its blade whistled through the air as the monster drew back its tentacle and the second swept in to smash into her right side. Her vision tumbled chaotically. She activated her hairpin, using the enchantment to twist herself in midair. Ludmilla's boot heel slammed into the base of the stone outcropping and she immediately launched herself back at her opponent, feet tapping along the forest floor as she added strength and perception to her focus reserve. As the tentacle that struck her aside drew back, the other whipped forward. Ludmilla activated evasion and her form blurred around the attack. A flick of her wrist sent the blade of her glaive towards the inside of the overextended tentacle, yet the monster still managed to draw the appendage out of the way. Well, that was just a bonus anyway. Ludmilla continued forward, driving her weapon into the toothy maw of her opponent. The massive feline head twisted away in response, causing her weapon to exit from its left cheek. She twisted her grip again, pulling a slash in the opposite direction. Steaming blood spattered the forest floor as Ludmilla ripped open the Pack Lord's opposite cheek. Unfortunately, she didn't get the cat's tongue. A clawed paw as wide as she was tall swiped out at her. Her fortress blocked the attack, but then a tentacle rolled in from above and flicked her away. With her fly item still active, she flipped backwards in a controlled arc. Then the second tentacle slapped her to the ground. She righted herself just in time to catch the first tentacle with another fortress. This thing is too smart to be dumb. It was aware enough that it knew to keep her at the end of its 7-meter measure and dexterous enough to avoid strikes meant to remove that advantage. The thing was spiteful enough to strike out at the Imperial army, so flying out of range to fill it with arrows would probably lead to it running around and killing everyone else. She had long confirmed that she had 4 focus stages available, and between holding ability boost, wind stride, and strengthened perception, it felt like she was able to at least keep up with her opponent's pace. Getting hit by the tentacles hurt, but her damage reduction made impacts with the ground negligible. The monster did not appear to have any regeneration, but neither did it appear to be suffering from any fatigue. Ludmilla suspected that slowly working it down would only lead to it running away, and it was far faster than she. This would be an acceptable outcome, except she didn't know whether it would simply come back and ambush the battalion later. Ludmilla took a step forward. Her opponent raised its tentacles threateningly. She released her wind stride and advanced. 2 steps later, a tentacle snapped towards her. She sidestepped the attack with evasion and took a stab at the broad end that slammed into the ground. Predictably, it slipped away without so much as a nick. Her fortress stopped the follow-up swipe by the second tentacle, which then drew away from her follow-up cut. She took a step forward. The Pack Lord nimbly hopped back, resetting the distance between them. Annoying. For all of her admonition to the adventurers who struggled against her polearm's measure, she herself had not learned Shukuchi, thinking that it was lower on her list of priorities. It didn't help that it didn't seem to be a part of her school of combat. Now, she was the one being outmeasured by her opponent. Unfortunately, challenging shout only focused her target's attention on her, and they could still attack using any method that they chose. Ludmilla stepped forward again, this time more aggressively. The monster's first strike was parried by a fortress, as was the next. She continued advancing, testing the limits of its endurance and searching for patterns that she might be able to take advantage of. A few exchanges later, movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. "Ook, get that kitty." She activated wind stride again, dashing forward as the mountain troll thundered in. The Pack Lord's feline head went back and forth in bewilderment. A 5-meter-long quarterstaff slammed into an empty spot on the ground. Ludmilla frowned. "Not there, there." Ludmilla ran left around their adversary, dodging another tentacle strike. Its second tentacle went the other way, ripping Ook's face off. The mountain troll cried out in rage, swinging blindly every which way. Ludmilla used the opening to drive a blossoming iris into the monster's front right shoulder, hopping back to avoid the retaliatory swipe of its claws. It turned its attention fully on her, attempting to drive her out of range again. Grab it when you can see again. She returned to a defensive posture while Ook regenerated his face, noting that the Pack Lord's attacks had grown weaker. It seemed that at least some of the ability damage had gotten through. The mountain troll stopped flailing wildly about, stepping in the rough direction of their opponent. Overhead, a tentacle turned in Ook's direction. "Nope," Ludmilla said. "Over here." She evaded the attack that whipped in response to her challenging shout. Ook wrapped his arms around nothing in particular. Ludmilla shook her head as she continued to force the monster's attention on herself. It seemed almost random as to whether he would finally get his hands on the right monster. He eventually did, however, leaning forward to grab their opponent around its midsection and lifting it from the ground. The giant six-legged cat thing flailed furiously, its roars shaking the air. Ludmilla released her wind stride and strengthened perception, flipping her glaive around. A blossoming iris thumped into the monster's belly, driving the wind out of it. Since the advanced strike art effectively hit 3 times, the ability damage effect of her glaive piled on rapidly as she continued to attack. Using third-stage martial arts in rapid succession, while not physically tiring for an undead being, was still mentally draining, so she switched to whacking their grappled opponent with mundane attacks. The Pack Lord grew weaker and weaker until Ook was finally able to shift his grip and snap its neck. Ludmilla let out a breath, planting the base of her glaive on the ground with her left hand. "Well, Ook," she looked up at the mountain troll. "How do you feel about a new cloak?" Dawn rose over a cold landscape carpeted with corpses. Hundreds of fallen Imperial Knights formed a solid line where Ray had chosen to take their stand. All along that bloody front were the thousands of demi-humans that had cast themselves at the battalion like waves crashing against the cliffs of the Golden Strand. Beyond those grisly details, the sheer mundanity of the morning could scarcely be believed. Birds filled the air with their cheerful calls and the sun's cold light glistened off of blood and dew alike. It was as if the world was telling them that the struggles of the night were nothing of note, nothing that deserved fanfare or mourning. Ray's men stood around staring blankly at the night's handiwork. Officers stared at their shattered companies and survivors of the companies stared at their fallen officers. The frenzy of looting that always came over them after the battles of the battalion now seemed the last thing on anyone's mind. Of the 700 soldiers committed to the fight, less than half remained. Because their forces had been consolidated into specialized contingents, the losses were roughly uniform across all companies. Many of their sergeants had been slain as they were called on time and again to bolster faltering ranks. A third of the dragoons and their hippogriffs had fallen in similar efforts where the officers on the ground had been spent. The only company captains who had survived were Ceres and Hawk. Below the outcropping, Ray and his remaining officers gathered around Lady Zaradnik as she worked to carefully dress the giant corpse of the monster that had interjected itself into the battle with its pack. Even after a pitched battle that culminated in the slaying of what might count as a legendary foe, she looked none the worse for wear. Most of her demi-human company made their way over the landscape, scavenging what they could from their fallen enemies. Nearby, the trolls watched their chief with looks of anticipation. "Why are they looking at you like that, my lady?" Ray frowned. "There are certain tribal customs that appear to be common to the region, Your Excellency," Lady Zaradnik replied. "One of which is a belief that the strong will confer their strength upon those who consume them. Doesn't that mean you're a highly appetizing individual?" Of course. Of course. Even the idea of being eaten didn't seem to bother her. Ray frowned down at a hastily jotted down list of reports. While they had just gone through a harsh battle, they were still in hostile territory and time waited for no man. 382 dead, he muttered. 2/3 of the survivors combat ineffective until our mana catches up. Bennett, make sure our potions and mana go towards crippling injuries before they become permanent. After that, get back to half mana. We'll continue healing once our reserves are built up. Yes, sir. Bennett rose from where he was tending to a wounded man nearby. I'll make extra sure that the others understand. The senior cleric walked off to inform the battalion's healers. General Ray cast his gaze over the grisly aftermath of the battle. You didn't mention how your company did, my lady. The Baroness' lips twitched at the question. Her reply was uncharacteristically sheepish. That's, I believe I went from 300 to 9. 9? General Ray frowned. 900. Ray and his captains cast uncomprehending stares at her. In what world did one triple their forces after fighting a pitched battle with dire odds? Lady Zaradnik didn't look up at them as she continued her methodical work. Goblins are very adaptable, she said. I suppose in your terms they saw that their interests were better served under me, so several dozen small tribes switched sides as we fought our way through. I was hoping for some hobgoblins, but they all mysteriously died before I could ask. Never mind recruiting hobgoblins, General Ray said. I'm beginning to wonder if those jokes about you being a hobgoblin yourself are true. I'm fairly certain that the temples of the Six have over 5 centuries of my lineage on record, Lady Zaradnik replied. Besides, being a hobgoblin is not required to achieve this. Understanding the nature of the races that you interact with can lead to surprisingly elegant solutions. I don't suppose you could gather a legion's worth of demi-humans while we're up here? I suppose I could, the Baroness replied, but what I cannot do is feed a legion's worth of demi-humans. Not without eating our way all over the place. What I have right now should be close to the limit of what our movements can support in this environment. Then we shouldn't linger here, Ray muttered. The sooner we withdraw, the sooner we can get back to finishing our original objectives in the valley. Though their losses were severe, not finishing their work would squander their efforts thus far. You sure about that, sir? Captain Hawk asked. The men are spent. They're gonna be sick of fighting for a while. And the losses, at least give them some time to grieve. Grieve? Ray furrowed his brow. What reason have you to grieve? Captain Hawk lowered his fistful of reports, sending an incredulous gaze at General Ray. They were our men, sir, our comrades. We fought and bled together on the line. It could have been any one of us that died instead of them. It's natural to mourn them, yeah? Ray shared a long look with Lady Zaradnik. If there was one element of the Empire's martial tradition that his men could do with, it was the sense of grim purpose and stoic resolve of the martial nobility. You're from a town outside of our winter, aren't you, Hawk? Yeah. And you, Ceres, you're from Nixhaven? That's right, sir. Then listen up and listen well, that isn't how it works around here. Looks of confusion fell over the two captains. Ray scratched his temple. The men that lost their lives today didn't have them stolen, he told them. They weren't innocents murdered in an alley or killed in a raid. They didn't die of starvation or disease while living in the squalor of the cities. These men offered their lives in exchange for a chance to stand and challenge fate. To win a better future for themselves and the Empire. They didn't die in some meaningless, stupid way. I made sure of that. You and I and everyone who stood and fought with these men know exactly what they were here for. Only we know what it's like to be out here because their experiences are ours too. The temples and all the others back in the Empire who would speak as if some great tragedy had befallen these men are only offering lip service, saying what they think others want to hear. They don't understand who and what we are. They cannot. They only see conquering heroes if we succeed and tragedy if we don't, and they'll only remember for as long as it hurts or helps them in some way. Ray scanned the silent battlefield. His men had stopped what they were doing, their attention focused on him as he spoke. Those who brandished their blades may be struck down in return. Everything that happens in this place is a realm where only warriors tread. There is not just the camaraderie forged out of your shared struggles, but also the results rendered by your shared ambitions, for good or ill. That is why we do not mourn with selfish feelings of grief. To believe that they didn't know what they were getting into, to think that there might be something to avenge or hate your foes over when we are the aggressors, these thoughts are irrational and only feed irrational emotions. We are soldiers who have purposely chosen to advance with deadly purpose to make gains for the Empire, earning honor and glory in exchange for our service. Respect and remember them for their resolve, but do not mourn them nonsensically. His words rolled out through the trees and dissipated into the morning mist. Captain Ceres looked up from where he was staring at the mossy stones at their feet. Is that how you feel too, my lady? Martial obligations do not exist for the Empire's nobles, Lady Zaradnik replied, but they do exist for me. It is a bit different, but the general sentiment is the same. My authority is derived from duty, including one to put my life on the line when it is called for. When it comes to those who fell fulfilling their obligations, I do not mourn in a way that most would consider normal. Considering your obligations as soldiers of the 6th Legion, I do not disagree with General Ray's words to you. Your commander has shared something even more important than that, however. Something that both he and I and many others had to learn the hard way. The only people who can fully appreciate the lives of warriors are warriors themselves. Heartfelt or otherwise, any empathy that others express for you is based on their own. Many frustrations come with this reality. Your experiences may be discounted, you may feel underappreciated or be subjected to all manner of misapprehensions. But it is not something to scorn others over, they are simply incapable of fully relating. All we can do is fight to ensure that we receive our due recognition and prepare those who follow in our path for that same reality. Around them, the men started to move. Some helped the clerics as they commended the fallen to the gods. Others readied a place to store the dead and their equipment for future recovery. After an hour, Bennett returned from his rounds, casting a critical eye over the thousands of slain demi-humans nearby. "General," he said, "permission to..." "I swear, Bennett." Ray narrowed his eyes, "If you tell me that you want to purify the area, I'm going to strangle you." "It's a lot of death, sir." "It's a lot of work is what it is. We can't afford to linger here. I don't want something even more absurd coming around and killing the rest of us off. Besides, this isn't the last that this place has seen of the Empire." On that note, Lady Zaradnik said, "How are the other divisions progressing, Your Excellency?" He turned his attention from the Baroness, who had finished neatly packing away the remains of not only the Pack Lord but the corpses of its pack. "The 1st, 2nd and 3rd divisions are still fighting in the northern passes. The 4th and 5th are out of the passes and moving to hit those passes from behind." "What happens after that?" "After that, I suspect that General Gregan will become conservative again. Once he finishes fighting and receives our reports in detail, he'll likely call a general halt to operations to digest and rethink how we approach expansion into deep wilderness areas. We have to get as far as we can while we have a chance. The battalion still has 3 fresh companies that didn't get to join this fight, so we should be able to finish our advance to the pass before then. It's only a day from where we left off, anyway." Once the men were fit to move, Ray ordered a withdrawal to the central ridge of the plateau. They set up camp around noon and set off the following morning. They picked up the 2 companies in the outposts on the way back over the next 2 days and returned to their valley base camp on the 3rd day. The 4th day saw them resuming their march south with the 3 untouched companies, and the men in general had appeared to have returned to their general good spirits. "Say," one of Lady Zaradnik's men said, "don't you think that our fight was just like the battle in the 2nd volume of Dreams of Red? We were massively outnumbered and it had hobgoblins and everything." "Half of Ludwig's battalion wasn't demi-humans," another noted. "A giant 6-legged tentacle cat didn't attack his battalion, either," a third added. "Still gonna be one hell of a story to share," one of them grinned. "Might have to tone it down a bit or no one's gonna believe it." That much was probably true. It was a tale that grew more fantastic with every detail. One would be accused of being drunk before having had a single drop. "Does your experience make Dreams of Red better, or worse?" Lady Zaradnik asked. "Better for sure," the first man replied. "It just seems that much closer, you know? Some people have complained that it ain't realistic, but we know now that things like what goes on in the story really can happen." "In that case," the Baroness said, "what about accomplishing things the way that Rin does?" The men within earshot exchanged looks. Ray faced away from the discussion with a frown. Just because the story seemed more real to the men didn't mean that the most unrealistic character in the cast was suddenly relevant to them. Though Lady Zaradnik had given Ray much to think about when it came to how the foreign elements that they encountered might be approached and utilized, he was still fairly certain that the central bureaucracy would offer stiff resistance if it also meant an effective reduction in the territory that they could develop for taxable industries. "We did have Ook and all them join us," the man admitted, "but that was because you bested their boss. If Ludwig did it, I'd have no problem believing it. Rin though, I don't think anyone like that can exist." The terrain altered drastically over the course of the day as the battalion made its way towards the target site of their next outpost. They reached the junction where they were originally supposed to meet the forces coming down from the Katsa Marches, which stood at the mouth of a mist-covered valley that stretched off into the east. Rising through the mist was a forest of sandstone pillars over 1,000 meters high. Ray's battalion gaped at the exotic landscape, but he could only see a strategic and tactical nightmare. "Well," Ray said, "this might require a drastic shift in our approach." As they gathered before the mouth of the valley, they started to catch glimpses of its occupants. Hundreds of winged shadows flew between what seemed like thousands of sandstone spires with dwellings built atop their pinnacles and the heads of their scarps. Each shadow was a wyvern, a smaller relative of dragons. Adult wyverns had wingspans at least 7 meters wide, and Ray spotted several larger individuals amongst the ones flying ahead of them. "I hope you can hit all those, Destin," one of the men nearby breathed. "What?" the ranger squawked. "My bow won't even reach them. They'll just drop rocks on us until we're done." "The dragoons need to. We have 4 hippogriffs. They're not fighting hundreds of wyverns." The men of the battalion shifted uncomfortably as they realized how hopeless their prospects were. Ray recalled the wyvern flights that had been watching them fight their way across the wilderness for the past 2 weeks. His battalion probably hadn't made the best of impressions. "So, do we have any kind of plan if they attack us?" someone asked. "Maybe Lady Zaradnik can do something." "Unfortunately, I didn't bring my dragon with me. She's not anywhere nearby, either." They turned their stares at the Baroness. She had a dragon? With everything that had happened, Ray doubted that anyone would question the claim. Lady Zaradnik's gaze flickered back and forth between them. "Sorry?" she said. As they stood about at a loss, a pair of dark figures flew towards them, shrouded by the mist. A sense of foreboding rose as they loomed closer. Ray's eyes widened in shock when their forms resolved into something recognizable. "Whoa, wait a minute!" a cleric cried. "We didn't ask for this. Why are there undead here?" The men of the battalion backed their horses away as 2 dragon-like forms closed on their position. It took a moment for Ray's mind to unfreeze. Skeletal dragons, what's going on here? Though they appeared imposing, skeletal dragons were weaker than the wyverns in the valley ahead. As they came within a few hundred meters, however, Ray's alarm rose again as he spotted a robe-clad figure on each. Baleful crimson gazes scanned the ranks of the company. Elder liches, riding skeletal dragons. Did the undead of Katsa spread? "Shut up, you idiots. Katsa has been claimed by the Sorceress Kingdom." Ray snapped the men out of their mounting panic. Several dozen meters away, the skeletal dragons landed. A pair of women looked out at them from behind the elder liches before dismounting to alight on the stones of the pass. Unfiltered murmurs of admiration rose from the men, the appearances of the approaching women overriding their dread and confusion. The first had a head of shoulder-length blonde hair which framed a petite face with an imperial aristocrat's features. Eyes of blue topaz glimmered with mischievous light as they came towards them. The second was probably too dangerous to let close to the men. Sensuous femininity exuded from every feature, and loose waves of burnished gold flowed over shoulders draped in a light dress shrouding a perilously seductive figure. The 2 stopped a handful of meters away. "Boo?" the first woman said. "Wagner," Lady Zaradnik frowned. "What?" the woman frowned back. "You're the one that's late. Do you know how long we've been waiting around while you've been enjoying yourself with all these men?" "There was an unexpected detour," the Baroness replied. "How long did it take you?" "Us? 2 days. Gagne just did her thing and they were doomed." "Ow?" Ray blinked. Did the woman with the long blonde hair just hit her companion on the arm? It had happened so quickly that it might have been his imagination. "Well, sorry for being late," Lady Zaradnik replied. "All I can do is stab things, and that takes time." Ray dismounted from his warhorse, walking up behind the Baroness. "You appear to know these women, Lady Zaradnik." Apologies for the late introduction, Your Excellency." Lady Zaradnik turned to gracefully sweep out her arm. "This is Countess Leanne Loretta Dale Wagner." "Hey, the Countess grinned. "And this is Baroness Florian Cadia Dale Gagne." "Hello." The Baroness smiled shyly. Wistful sighs rose at Baroness Gagne's demure greeting. Countess Wagner frowned. "Like myself," Lady Zaradnik continued, "they are vassals of Lady Sheltir Bloodfallen, who serves as the Sorceress Kingdom's Minister of Transportation." A countess and a baroness out in the middle of nowhere. Did nobles of the Sorceress Kingdom just pop up wherever they wanted to? "Lady Wagner, Lady Gagne," Lady Zaradnik said, "this is General Ray of the 6th Legion. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, General Ray bowed politely. Countess Wagner, Baroness Gonye. You must forgive my confusion over your presence here. We dropped by to see some of our new neighbors, Lady Wagner said. New neighbors, my lady? Countess Wagner placed her left hand on her waist, turning slightly to look behind her at the misty valley. The Confederation of the Sandstone Forest, she said. You might know them as the Wyvern Rider tribes. For the time being, we've started with a bit of trade through Katsa, but I'm sure we'll develop a wonderful relationship over the years to come. It took all of 2 seconds for Ray's expression to portray his realization of what that meant. His gaze went from Countess Wagner to Baroness Gonye, then to Baroness Zaradnik. Does this mean what I think it means, Lady Zaradnik? I can only speculate as to what you're thinking, Lady Zaradnik replied, but Countess Wagner's statement means that this tribal confederation has received official recognition as a political and economic body by the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The Baharuth Empire is but one of countless actors in the world, Your Excellency. As a general of an expeditionary army, it is something that you should always keep in mind.